Thank you. My name is David. I'm going to be moderating this panel. We have some exciting things from our panelists to talk about today. This is the They Look Like Me Bodies in Nerd Culture panel. It's a panel about seeing ourselves reflected in the nerd media that we love and how that helps us and how it affects us when we don't see ourselves when we look around in that world. And we're especially talking about bodies today. I want to introduce everybody, or let them introduce themselves. We'll start with Sam. Just want to go down the way a little bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm Sam DeLev. I'm a professional role-playing performer on Twitch and podcast, perhaps best known for some Geek and Sundry productions, including Callisto 6 and Shield of Tomorrow. I get to represent a lot of non-binary and disabled characters all the time. It's super exciting.
I'm Sarah Kuhn. I write the HEROINE COMPLEX series, which is a series of books about Asian American superheroes. And I am also writing a graphic novel for DC about Cassandra Cain, who is the Asian Batgirl. And then I just write a bunch of other assorted.
Cassandra Cain.
The speakers are still working, so that's
There we go. Sam disappeared.
I'm gonna get an extra 4d6 on that.
someone leaning against the light switch. Is that what that is?
Yeah, okay.
I think it's connected to the other one.
Wait. Ignore.
All right.
So Sarah,
That was pretty much it. I got distracted by the light show. Christy.
My name is Christy Black, and I am one of the owners, along with David, of Hero's Journey Fitness, which is a gym in the Los Angeles area. We're in Burbank, and we specialize in making fitness accessible to everyone. Our motto is "Fitness belongs to everyone," and especially nerds and geeks. Not traditional gym fitness communities.
B. Walters. I go wherever Sam will let me come along with them. I write Dungeons and Dragons and Darkened Wish for IDW Comics. I do a little show called Vampire the Masquerade, LA by Night, on Sundry also, and probably 4 or 5 other things that I'm not thinking of right now. I guess I've been labeled a pro dungeon master, which is weird, and I kind of love it, but it's also weird.
My husband's a pro dungeon master. But the other not the other. Hi, my name is Mairghread Scott. I'm a writer for comic books and cartoons. My most recent comic book was Batgirl from DC Comics. I've also done Transformers, Power Rangers. I'm going to be doing a special about historical slayers for the Bucky franchise. And then on the And then on the cartoon side, my most recent project is Magic the Gathering at Netflix.
Yeah. All right, thank you, everybody. So, as we talked about at the beginning, the premise of this panel, just at a base, the idea is that when we see our bodies reflected in popular media, that is important for our well-being, for our sense of self, and we've historically not done a great job with that, frankly, for anyone except for me. Mid-40s white man, and I've been well served historically. So apart from that, we've not done a great job. And that's whether we're talking about gender expression, skin color, body type, disability, or any of the ways that we are physically diverse. So I guess the first thing I'd like to understand is in the various industries represented here, how are we doing right now? Just if anybody who wants to jump in the places where you write and the places where you create, how are we doing right now?
I'll go. I can go. So in the fitness community, it's very binary as far as what people think your goals are. So for women, it's almost automatically assume that you want to lose weight, you want to lose body fat, you want to tone your muscles, which isn't really a real thing, and just be like slender. And for men, that you want to get super jacked. And that's not the case for most of the people that I work with. It's not case for me. I want to be super strong. I want to be She-Hulk. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, she's my favorite. We came into the world in the same year, so.
I would say better, simply because conversations like this are happening. I know we'll get into the minutiae of some of the representation that we've done in some of our projects, but just the fact that companies and brands and individuals are being conscious about their media consumption and what they're putting out into the world, and that they are portraying different kinds of people versus just a couple of years ago, that wasn't even a thing. And then when it was a thing, it was very much dismissed, and now it's like, oh wait, that's a thing, you know? Like if we reflect people accurately, people will come. Like in my lifetime, I've very much seen Wonder Woman going from an impossible franchise to like, oh, it made all the money. Weird.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually remember when I started writing cartoons, there was the fear that if you included women in a boys' franchise, it would poison the toy line for the boys. Like, it wasn't even like we want to attract girls. It was like we don't want to offend dads, like with the presence of women. But so yeah, so I guess better up from nothing.
In kind of the books and comics world that I work in, I feel like there is progress happening now. Like it actually feels like we're at a bit of a tipping point as far as that's concerned. But it is certainly still slow, and there's certainly still a long way to go. But I think what I've sort of seen that's been very encouraging is a lot of times, especially when I've gone into writing licensed or pitching licensed or things like that, I sort of started out going in with this assumption that these companies will kind of want to maintain the status quo, like I should sort of pitch in that area instead of trying to push things a little bit. And I've actually found like sometimes that is the case. Like I wrote a series of Barbie comics, and they kind of want Barbie to say Barbie. Like you can't really, there are things you can do within that construct, but at the end of the day, she still has to be recognizably what we know as Barbie. But when I brought things up, like with DC, when they were first looking for pitches for this YA line that I'm writing the Cassandra book for, they sent us this list of characters. It was sort of like, these are sort of the characters we're looking for pitches on, and it was mostly the characters who were in TV and movie franchises like the Mara and the Teen Titans and like things like that. And they enlisted Batgirl, and I just kind of assumed that only means Barbara Gordon. Like obviously what they're looking for at this stage would only be Barbara Gordon. So I did two pitches. I did a Starfire, which I thought was the one they would want, and it wasn't. And I did Batgirl, but I did Cassandra Cain just as kind of like a, maybe this, has a chance somewhere of getting through. And then that was actually the one they wanted. So that was an instance where I was actually very pleasantly surprised by the progress that had been made, and by the fact that what they were looking for was actually not just upholding the status quo, it was something a little bit different.
I have to say, as a fan of Batgirl, please keep her from Detroit. Like, I loved Cassandra Cain because I was like, she's from Detroit, yay!
I thought you meant please keep her from Detroit, like keep her away from
Like, don't let Cassandra Cain go to Detroit.
So in RPG streaming spaces and in podcasting, it's a tiny creative space in terms of audience compared to things like TV and film and even comics, but it is one of the most exciting in terms of representation, in part because as players, as cast members and performers, it's one of the rare media where we also have a lot of authorship, where I'm not reading off of someone else's script, where I just gotta hope that that writer is on side, and that writer part of an established industry that benefits from all of the entrenchment and social structures that we usually see by players directly creating and writing characters. It's an excellent space because if you can nail casting, then you have a wonderful potential for own voices content. And I don't get to see me. That's not a thing that I get on TV and film and movies, certainly not at the cross sections where I exist. I can get a part of me or a different part of me. I'm not getting the whole breakfast burrito. But because I get to be an author of characters as a performer in RPG, I get to make the rep and they get to like it. But equally, we get to put it out in the world and see that it doesn't scare people and that people are activated by this. The direct relationship between RPG streamers and our audience allows us to have that communication and that feedback and to see the impact of it directly in a way that so many other media don't get to.
Before we dive into our individual projects, there's one more sort of general thing that I wanted to talk about. Is in part because we're all friends up here, and I have been in spaces with some of you when you have seen yourself unexpectedly represented, whether in like a TV show or a movie or a book or something, and I've witnessed that. But before we dig into maybe how hard it is and how we can change, I'd love to, if you've got like just a quick story or something that the first time maybe that you really identified with someone who you saw either on screen or on TV or in a stream or in a book that you read, and what that change is. Why is this so important?
Oh my gosh, I have one. My friends, Jackson Lansing and Colin Kelly, wrote Gotham City Garage for DC, which is a bit of an alt dystopia. It was great. And in that AU, Jimmy Olsen was a wheelchair user, which was beautifully drawn, which is already super exciting. Getting beautifully drawn wheelchairs is a very specific thing. But what made it such a remarkable and unusual moment for me was that they put into the script a couple panels where Jimmy gets out of his chair and sits on the ground. And that seems like such a small thing, but when I started thinking, I've never seen that. Wheelchair users are locked into our chairs. People literally think we sleep in them. Most of us don't. But it's not just seeing someone that has the same checkbox identity, but seeing a real behavior, seeing a thing that you know from yourself. That matters so much to me. I love that. I have that panel just screen capped for life.
I guess I had, it's funny because obviously as an able-bodied white lady, there's a lot more of us around, but they weren't exactly positive representations growing up. Like I remember playing X-Men as a kid, and they'd be like, I'm like, I want to be Storm. And they're like, you can't because you're white. They're like, you're gonna be Jean Grey. And then at some point someone would be like, now you have to pass out. Because that's what she did in the show. A lot.
It's the perfect way to nurse somebody's power. You pass out now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The story goes on.
I remember watching, actually it was Force Awakens, and I remember going to see Force Awakens, and all the posters had Finn with the lightsaber, and I was like, okay, we're gonna get like another Black Jedi, that's cool. But Rey's gonna be important, like that's nice, like yay, like ladies, and I remember that moment when, and I started realizing, I was like, this arc, like, he's important, but she's the main character of this arc. Like, this is gonna be, I was like, is she gonna be the Jedi? No. Is she? No. Is she? And yeah, I remember the moment she caught the lightsaber, and I had like tears in my eyes, and it was exactly that moment of, have you guys ever seen The Last Unicorn? When the unicorn comes to the one lady, and she's like, why have you come to me now when I'm old and not the beautiful maidens you always come to? But I had this weird realization where it was like, this is amazing, and also this moment where it's like, if I was 6, this would be everything. Like if this was normal, like if I had this when I was 6, my life would be different. And it's like, this is what all my guy friends talked about when they talked about Luke Skywalker. And I was like, yeah, Luke Skywalker's great, it's a nice story or whatever, but like, now it's like, oh fuck, I get it now. Like, I get it. Like, because it's like, oh yeah, Luke Skywalker's good, but like when she caught that lightsaber and like, oh, she's the main character, I was like, oh no, now I got you for saying bad things about her. Like, now I get it. And it's just, you just get that moment, and then of course we all have that moment where the next thing you think is like, do white guys feel like this all the time? This is awesome. Yeah, it's like no wonder. Like I mean, like I'm kind of, I have like a weird sympathy for like, if every movie, and every action movie you walked into, I felt like that Rey Star Wars moment, and then it's like, oh, now I have to relate to other people. Dang it. Like, I used to know that every action movie would be about me. But yeah, that was my moment.
Odd curveball, but believe it or not, the time that I was most proud to see myself reflected in the media was when Barack Obama became president. For me, I think it always came up like from when I was young. My mom was a big fan of science fiction, and she would get me into these things. And it very much was like, here's Star Trek, which is incredible, but also can I talk to you about her? You know, here's Deep Space Nine, which is incredible, but also Sisko's in charge. But it's been such an odd trajectory, though, of us occasionally getting scraps. Because Sisko was in charge, but he's not a captain, though, you know? It's like, and so it has been this like fits and starts, but I think probably the most recent time was Black Panther. Because the character that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby created at the time, I don't think they really get enough credit for what they did. Because they created this man in the middle of the 60s, in the middle of the civil rights struggle, who was not just a good man, he was the best man. And Wakanda wasn't just a good place, it was the best place. You know, like T'Challa shows up and works all 4 members of the Fantastic Four. You know, and they didn't have to do that. And to see that pay off now, and still have Wakanda be the best place, and still have them be the best and brightest people, it was wonderful. And honestly, I felt similar along that similar vein with the portrayal of Themyscira in Wonder Woman. That I was like, oh, they're beautiful and powerful, and they're not just angry and brooding, and they like do stuff and have art and fun and fight and are complete people. It's incredible.
And they're beautiful because they're powerful. They're not beautiful for you to think they are not there for you to think they are beautiful. Like, but yeah, no, I get you. It's weird when it's like you're always almost there. Like,
too. So you had older Amazons and younger, it wasn't just like mid-20s.
well, they were built like whatever they did. Like all the horse ladies looked like people who ran horses.
I don't want to like derail this by getting too granular, but I remember ahead of the thing, there was this huge scandal about like, oh, their costumes are too skimpy. And if you remember in, I think this was actually Justice League, there was the scene when the walls collapsing and they grab it, and they just looked so strong, man. They were just like, ah, and I was like,
And they cast women that were already strong. They weren't necessarily for a lot of the Amazons.
It was a lot of athletes.
It was a lot of athletes. Yeah, it was pretty amazing. So I had a very intense reaction to Wonder Woman and Themyscira and all the Amazons, since we've already talked about that. I think for me in my adult life, I mean, I was a blonde-haired white kid, middle-class kid, so I saw lots of representation of me as a kid. But as an adult, I think the most powerful property that for me was about 10 years ago, Justin Stokely and I were having a conversation about bodies, and he's a comic book artist, and he's like, you really should check out Sophie Campbell's Wet Moon, which is like a goth comic, and I am not a goth. I got like Rainbow Bright in my soul. But it was the first time that I read a comic where I saw all types of bodies, and in vulnerable scenes where they were really vulnerable, and you saw rolls, and you saw like tummy rolls, and you saw short people and tall people and queer people, and it was just all over the place, and it was beautiful. And I think, and at the time that I saw it, Sophie Campbell had not yet transitioned and was still going by Ross Campbell, and it really was once she transitioned, it was a good reminder that it is so important for all creators to have a voice, because it gave such a beautiful thing, because she wasn't middle-aged white man. And I'm a little middle-aged white man, so I get it.
Some of my best friends.
you need to say this like declaratively.
Yeah.
None of us have anything against white people. Against Stan Lee, George Lucas, changed my life. I am who I am because of those people. So that's not what anybody's saying. Because every once in a while we get that need. I mean, you guys are cool. You got up at 10 in the morning on the first day of college. Like, someone may be listening to this and hear about it and be like, yeah. Like, that is what it sounds like to me, by the way.
Yeah, it's like grown-ups in the penis game.
I feel like women of color are still kind of fighting for those scraps. Like, it's still kind of at the starting point for us. I think what's been interesting for me is like, I had gotten so used to, over the years, just loving these franchises. I also grew up on sci-fi and fantasy and Star Wars and Star Trek, and these were sort of like ingrained in my DNA, but I had just gotten so used to not seeing myself in them, even as like a very supporting character, that I kind of just started to feel like, that was a given, that it was never going to happen. Like, that wasn't really something I could even think about. But I do feel like there are some things happening now, and one thing that sort of surprised me coming out of that mindset of just like assuming this is, I'm never really going to see it, is how much it affects me even when it is something small. So like, I'm thinking of, also in Force Awakens, there's that moment with the fighter pilot, Jess Pava, who is played by a mixed race Asian woman. And she's not in it very much, but as soon as she showed up, I remember sitting next to my friend Drea, and we were like elbowing each other because we're like, oh my God, like, this is happening. Like, it's like 5 minutes of film, but it's the most exciting thing ever because there's like a mixed race Asian woman in Star Wars, like in this thing that we sort of grew up loving. And then of course our next reaction was like, she's going to die. Like, this is like, so that she's like gonna crash into something and blow up. And then the fact that she survived was like kind of a miracle. So then to go to Last Jedi, where there were actually two, sisters, Rose and Paige, was even more so, and felt like even more of a step forward. And again, it felt that sort of like just deeply emotional thing where you're like, this is something that I have always loved, and now there is finally a face like mine. Like, I can exist in this world. I can exist in this story. So I think like for us, like even when something is very small, it's still very momentous. But of course, I'm hoping that things continue to improve.
So this is actually a great transition into sort of the next question I have for all of you as creators and makers of things and helpers of people, is that we see a lot on social media and a lot of a call for creators, please be better about this, get better. And as I think all of you said, it is getting better, but there are obviously obstacles, or you would all be creating the full panoply of whatever it is that you want to see. So can we talk about why is this so hard? Like, what are the things? I mean, Mairghread talked about a little bit. I worked at a big company for a little while where the first question when I sat down as a consultant there was, is this for a boy or for a girl? And we were unable to break through that barrier at this product company. It was very frustrating for me, and that's for me. But what are the barriers you're facing?
I would say the number one most powerful thing you all can do is vote with your wallet. If somebody is making something that you want, support that thing. If they're making something close to it, support that thing. Again, now it seems like a lifetime ago, ahead of Black Panther, there was a movement in some communities that were like, boycott Black Panther because they didn't really shoot it in Africa. I was like, no! Don't do that. It's not the lesson they will take from this. Because it is a business, they do try and boil down the spreadsheets and who's going to buy what. And the greater extent that you can show a company, one, that you can show a big company with its profit, or a small creator. There's something called 1,000 loyal fans. If you're not familiar with it, Google it later. If there's somebody that's making a little webcomic or something they're printing out of their basement, and that's the thing you love, support that thing. Because you'll be surprised how quickly something can pick up and like catch on fire and take off. So, yeah.
Yeah, I remember seeing Wonder Woman and being like, please don't suck, but also being like, I don't even care if this sucks. If this, I'm never gonna say it sucks, and we're gonna see this 8 times.
Nothing made me say bad things about it.
No. Like, literally, she would have had to, like, it would have had to start with the crotch shot. And I would have had to been so bad. But I was like, this is getting my money. I mean, there's a couple of things from a creator's perspective, and I'm gonna try and be really open and honest here. One is, there's a sort of terrible realization that you have to have that you can't win. When you're a creator, and I'll just speak for myself as a writer. When I'm a writer and I'm trying to write, diversify my cast, I'm trying to tell other people's stories. And I have X amount of dollars, and I have X amount of time, and I have X amount of effort that I can devote to that, for it to be financially viable, for me to get this book out on time, that kind of stuff. And also these are characters. They may be characters that are pre-existing, they have things that are set in stone in their stories, they may be characters I'm inventing that have certain roles to fulfill in the plot. The biggest thing though is that whenever you do representation, at some point someone is going to say, that is not me. And eventually at some point, everyone is going to say, that is not me. If you go back, and I always say that the thing you have to accept about the arc of history, Martin Luther King talked about the long arc of history. The arc of history is long bends towards justice. That means that hopefully in 250 years we'll all be considered backwards bigots by our kids. And everything I write will be considered just, we'll have to start doing the air quotes of for her time. This is acceptable in the time, and that's really hard to admit, because your first thought as a creator is well, I just want to include those people, and then, Black Twitter won't yell at me when I screw it up. But that's the responsibility for the privilege you have of telling stories, is to add those stories and to make your world accurately reflect the world that you're presenting as much as possible. And so it's one of those things where it's you have to do your best, you have to try a legitimate amount, you have to set this is my logic, this is what I think about this character, this is where I think this character is going, this is the research I've tried to do to make my best faith effort, I'm gonna put it out there, and then eventually, because it does always happen, at least one or two people are gonna come to you and say, you fucked up, and I don't like your take, and I feel like you just have to be able to tell yourself, I hear you, this is what I was going for. I have a logic base to that, and but that doesn't mean I succeeded, and you gotta take that criticism and move on to the next thing. And so it's a weird balance of it's emotionally taxing to feel like you're trying to make this leap and, include everyone under the rainbow, and also realize that you're never gonna make it to that end of the rainbow, but it really is, you've gotta try. You've gotta try, because even an imperfect attempt is better than nothing.
I know I said something, and I apologize for double monologuing, but it is relevant this time. I just went through something similar with this, with Darkened Wish, when I created my characters for that. Although, believe it or not, and this is the blackest of heresy, which I'm not supposed to talk about, but a lot of these characters were created as World of Warcraft fan fiction quite some time ago. When I had the chance to write a D&D story, they kind of already lived in my mind to a certain extent. But my original take on Karn and Karen, my twins, I did have them be kind of this amorphous, borderline almost autistic kind of very unusual set of twins. And it was actually Sam, when I was working on the book, that said, hey, can they be non-binary? And I was like, yeah. And so then that's changed for them. And then later on, Tess was like, hey, can we make them black? And I was like, yeah. And then that changed for them again. What I knew I wanted to do was, I knew two things when I started this book. I knew I wanted to have a female lead who could be powerful again and actually be, people throw around flawed, it's so dang cliche, but that's not what I mean. But she's angry, but she's not bitter, if that makes sense. And she's still powerful, and she's still an arch wizard that can do anything and still be a complete human being. And I wanted to portray these people as complete human beings. And to WotC's credit, I got no pushback on that. I got all kinds of pushback on how big a goblin's ears can be. We ran back and forth. The red dragon's brow ridge can only be this, and we're but as long as the dragon stays red, these people can be black, though, right? I'm very proud that that's something we got to introduce, the fact that there are gnomes that look Asian, that there's gnomes that look black, that there's dwarves that look something other than Scottish tropes.
It's funny you mentioned flaws, because I remember thinking at one point, I had this terrible realization that the reason, because I remember early in my career too, like writing a female, or there was a show I was working on, I wasn't even writing on it, but there was a note from executive that was basically like, the girl can't have flaws. And I was like, why is that? Yeah, she'll be unlikable. And I was like, why is that? Like, why is that? And why is it that so many people become model minorities? And I've come to this, and this is just my own personal belief, it's so important to make characters that aren't represented have flaws, because otherwise I feel like the message is the flaw is their minorityness. Like, there's this saying in sci-fi that you only get one, the audience will buy one weird conceit, so you can't have time travel and also something, you can't have time travel and magic, you know, or whatever, like you can have one or the other. And I've started to come to the belief that the reason when people push that like, oh, this character is black, or this character is non-binary, or this character is whatever, they can't have flaws, it can come from the best of places where it's like, we don't want to seem like we're saying something about that whole group because we've only got one. But I think subconsciously, I'm starting to come to believe that what we're really saying is the flaw is their minority. And that's why they can't have, that's their one. And I've been really trying to push back in my writing where it's like, we can't, right, if we can't portray people as complete human beings, then we're not doing them this, we're not doing them a service.
Sarah, you were about to jump in here.
Oh, yeah, well, just to kind of speak to your point about sort of why is this kind of still not progressing maybe as fast as all of us who are trying to write these inclusive stories with full human characters would like it to. I think part of the problem too is that so many of the gatekeepers are still kind of the dominant culture. Like, so I think a lot of times, like, people are very well-meaning and they'll say, we want diversity, we want to be inclusive, we want this to look like the real world. But they still have that sort of inherent bias that is like, if they see this story with the face they don't expect, if you know, it's a white female editor and she's all her life seen herself sort of reflected in things, you then present something with a different face. Sometimes it's like, well, I don't really get it, or I can't see it. Or the one that a lot of, especially people of color get is, I just couldn't connect to it. Like, because it's not sort of their exact experience they're used to. So I think a lot of like what I've tried to do is try to figure out how to sort of navigate that, where maybe I can explain it in a way that gets to this sort of whatever universal human truth is, or gets to like something that maybe, you know, everyone can connect to and understand. And that's hard. It's like a lot of time composing really long emails. But I think that if we can move forward to getting to a place where everyone sort of has that kind of empathy for each other, where you can say, this is not my exact experience, but I still understand it, that would kind of go a long way.
You know, it's funny, I have a down and dirty trick that's actually the opposite of that, which is I just use raw data. So like I have a general rule for myself that I only mention a female character needs more representation if female representation in a show dips below 10%. I've been on 2 shows where I haven't gone past, like haven't had to bring it up. And yeah, and I'll literally just, the people will be like, oh, do we really need more women? And I was like, we are under 10% representation. Like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 girl. Like that's what I'm looking for, you know? And then I remember I was consulting on a project and we were trying to get more diversity. And so we pulled up the census data for America. And we were like, if we want the show to represent America, statistically speaking, there should be this number of black people, and this number of Hispanic people, and this number of Asian people, and this percentage of men versus women. And we started like, all right, like if you want this show to be representative, this is what the raw data actually says, you know, quote unquote, if America was a city, this is what it would look like. Or if America was a cast, this is what it would look like.
So I'm working in a slightly smaller medium. So we have a physical gym and we push things out into the world. But one of the things that, I mean, there's 2 things I'd like to talk about that. One is I don't know that you would look at me and be like, she's a fitness trainer. She's leading this gym. I'm not 15% body fat. I deal with depression. I deal with lots of things. I'm actually coming off of a low-level long period of depression, which made me gain weight. And then it brings up those like imposter syndromes kind of things, and I'm leading this community. But what we go back to is that
there's no one goal for any person when you're navigating your health and fitness. We all have different things that we want from that, and so we try really hard to create a space where everything dynamically scales for what your intent for being there is, and that there's no reference to, like, a lot of times we go to a gym and they'll be like, the 45-pound barbell is the barbell, and then the 35-pound barbell is the lady barbell. So which one's the lady bar? Or they'll write a workout and say men do this weight and women do this weight, and that
Which leaves out a whole swath of people.
whole lot of people are completely left out, and that weight may be too light for me, or too heavy for me, or not right for me in that movement. So we do a lot of, like, working into intent of what do you need, what do you need in this space. And then the other thing that we do is we're trying really hard. We theme a lot of workouts based on stories, and we have lots of conversations with the people in our community of what they would like to see for that. So it's not just it's not just Captain America workouts. There's Okoye workouts. There are Urian ice workouts. We're just going along that spectrum of people, and we come back to that. There was a phrase that I came across through Girls Gone Strong, which is a fitness community, and it was there's a difference between all are welcome here, and this place was created with you in mind. And so we come back to that all the time, and we understand we're not always going to be able to have our space created for everybody's needs, but we are open to that conversation, and we are humble and willing to have that conversation. We want those conversations, and Sam works out with us, and we have conversations all the time about how do we make our place more inclusive, where everybody feels they have a space, that they are represented here in this, and that we are here specifically for them.
I have opinions.
Yeah. And Sam's on our advisory board, so let's go. So yeah, it's
Specifically for adaptation and accessibility, so that their gym was accessible to me from the ground up, which honestly is, I mean, beyond that, just generally being member in gyms. But it segues into what I might say to your question of why does this happen? Especially given that we are now in an era of at least greater awareness and more writers and creators who try in good faith. And yet when we watch, and I think a lot of why we see lack of inclusive representation, I think the reason why sometimes when we see it, it feels not us, is because the creators are people, and people have social circles. That people tend to have very homogenous social circles. White people mostly have white friends, and that's not, people of color statistically have a much more diverse friendship group. And it's like that for most marginalizations. Most of my friends, I'm their only wheelchair user friend. I know that. Before me, they probably didn't have one. They didn't have a disabled friend, particularly not one who was close enough in their life that you get to see them as people and see where people are different and where they aren't, and where something would be stereotyped. Because if you don't have friends, if you don't have real people you see being real people in your life as a creator, all you're drawing on is really secondhand, which means you're recycling media. You're recycling what someone else thought someone was, who in turn also didn't have a friend. And so it becomes, you build these stereotypes and these tropes that we see in media because it is a big old game of telephone, and the best way to break that, if you're a creator, is to have people in your life. It's why we can do what we do with that gym, because I am there. People can try in good faith, but if you don't know, have people, and sometimes that is professional consultancy, where you can get it, but there is no substitute for seeing people and loving them in your life and knowing them well enough that you really know their humanity.
I had an experience like that recently that I thought I was like Captain Woke, man, like I bleed blue. I wrote on a TV series called Salvage Marines, and with one of the leads is Peter Shinkoda, who played Nobu in Daredevil. And we were just sitting around talking one day, and he's like, "Could you do me a favor?" And I'm like, "Yeah." He's like, "Don't mess with my face." And I'm like, "What?" He's like, "Asian males, they're always messing with their faces." And I'm like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "We always have scars, masks, something's always wrong." And I'm like, "What?" And I'm like, Google the movies. And I'm like, whoa, so much so, we had written a thing where his face gets all messed up. We had done this. And we were like,
Did a facial disfiguration indicate that he had somehow gone dark or evil?
No, actually, he stayed. No.
The one time!
There was his two requests. He was like, no facial disfigurement and make sure I have a love scene. And I was like, bro, I will make your relationship the central narrative of the show. I don't care. But it was a thing that I didn't realize it happened until he pointed it out to me. Like, I was very clear on my marginalization with not his.
Yeah.
So I actually want to open up some questions. I have like 8 more questions for you guys. We talk about this all the time, and it's so important. But I would love for any questions if we've got some in the audience. Some hands go up. Right here, because I saw you comment on it first. Sure. You guys okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
We're beautiful.
So, I guess my question is, if I was a writer, if I was a director, I would like to, if I was recording something for Los Angeles, for example, I would do whatever you say that statistically I would say there's 10% Latinos, 10% Asians, 10% whatever. And I would try to include those kind of percentages in the story. In my story, but somebody told me when I was discussing with them, they said, why is that relevant to the story? Why is the diversity relevant to the story? And I would like to hear your take on that.
Oh yeah, diversity is relevant to the story because you're trying to accurately depict a place that exists.
Yeah.
Los Angeles isn't mostly white. So you are not accurately representing Los Angeles if you don't have a ton of Hispanic people and a bunch of other people. Like, it's just, diversity is important because we want to be real. Yeah, I wrote an adaptation of Macbeth set in 11th century Scotland, and we got crap for like putting some African-looking people and some Hispanic-looking, or well, not Hispanic, the Spanish-looking people, it was 11th century, in the background in a fight scene. But actually, at that time period, coastal communities traveled much faster than inland communities. And so the communities of that area, we have found artifacts going all the way to, Morocco and further. There's Egyptian lapis and Irish graves. And why do we have women there? Because that's what the science really says. That's what the history really says. And just because the Victorians sucked at history and assumed a lot of things, doesn't mean that we need to keep that lie perpetuating.
You also give the largest number of people a chance to engage with and love your content.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, I think that the question for the person asking that is, why do you assume that sort of like having an all-white cast is the default, which is still sort of like a thinking that persists. It's like, I've been asked before, like, we wrote this story about these two superheroines, why are they both Asian? And like, well, why is every other superhero in the history of the world white? Like, that doesn't make any sense either. Like, if you're making a character white, it's just as much of a choice as if you're making them a person of color. But for some reason, well, not for some reason, for everything we've been talking about this whole panel, there's still this assumption that like, if you have an all-white cast, that's like normal. That's like the default, when in fact that is highly unrealistic.
I've also yet to encounter anyone that was not a white male say to me,
Right there. Right there. Yes, you please.
So, in achieving a sense of diversity, and all I'm in a diverse world, and I appreciate diversity, but how do you avoid falling into the trap of tokenism or pushing for a sense of mediocrity? By that I mean, however you might want to represent the world, this is as good as you can be and never push the event.
Well, that's also, there's a question about, especially when it comes to tokenism, that's not always up to you. You don't know how long your run is going to be on a comic. So you don't know how many characters you can, include of any specific race. And there might only be one person, or you might not, you might only have a limited space for a story. I don't know, I guess I'd be interested to hear the other one's thought. I guess that's...
Well, I would say you also have to be wary of the fact that I had an experience where I was with a guy named Pastor Greg Price. He runs a really big church. And he's like, I want to make Christian science fiction. And I was like, stop right there, your sci-fi would be garbage. Because when you start with the identity first and then go to the story, it's going to be bad. Well, I would say as long as you're making that person full and compelling, and when you're like, I'm going to put in a sassy gay friend, do not do that.
Yeah.
Start off with a bunch of sassy gay characters.
Right.
Oh yeah, okay, so that's what we're talking about. So you know what it is I would get the thing where I've been in rooms where someone is described in terms of character traits, they'll write girl. And I always say girl is not a character trait. It's just a question of you can't make someone's ethnicity or disability or gender or sexual orientation a character trait. The character trait. That is not the character trait. They have to be a person who wants things, who also has this contextual element. So the way to avoid that kind of tokenism is just to be you need to be able to describe that character without, you need to describe that character as something more than their label.
They're not Muslim.
They're not non-Muslim. They are a person who wants this, who is Muslim. So that is a context that they interact with the world, but that's not the core of, that's not the only thing that they are.
That's the objective push to avoid winding up with, I want a character that can do this. But we've already got a bunch of these kind of representations of that character. But I already have that kind of person.
Man, we can't get into why it didn't happen. We know why it didn't happen.
I don't just mean you're going forward. I know what's already there. But when you sit down and kind of start with the frame creative thing, how do you avoid falling in that trap?
So like you said, it's your best faith effort in telling just the most interesting and compelling story that you can tell. That person should be able to exist and make sense and have their own internally consistent motivations for good or for ill that don't necessarily completely rely on any specific identity aspect of it. Unless the fact that, Superman's an alien, that's kind of important. But besides that.
We're going to do one more question because we started a second late. Right here.
So one of the beautiful things about increased diversity right now in inclusion is that we're seeing people who've always been there, who've always been in Scotland, who've always been present and active, being represented. I come from a group where we're small, we're tiny. There aren't many of us, and there are fewer of us. Demographics appealing to the most people getting money, that's not going to be what gets us representation. How do we get there? Will we ever get there?
Can I ask what your group is?
In this case, I'm neutral.
I would say first. Go for it. Wait, you're saying something?
Sometimes you do have to interface with people who aren't from your group. You cannot rely on an institution necessarily having it. It's one of the reasons why ground up content helps. It's why when you look at internet video where people are doing tiny things that you don't need to appeal to big production companies, it tends to be more diverse. It's why, a thing that you can point a webcam at and put on Twitch is infinitely more diverse than Marvel movies that haven't even made it gay enough yet. But yes, sometimes there's a numbers game, and that is why I say ignore statistics. Give me more. And that's how you avoid tokenism, because you don't have one Jewish person who might, as a character trait, exhibit something that in isolation is stereotypical, because you've got 6 other Jews there who don't have that trait. I can play a villain without falling into an evil cripple trope if there are a bunch of other disabled people who aren't also evil. That, yeah, people are gonna say numbers, and that's why it's important to start showing that you can have these characters and they're people, and you can do that in the content that small creators are generating, and it's why it's so important to support small indie content creators. But ultimately, yeah, no. Forget statistics are a floor, and the thing you have to use as an argument sometimes. They should never be a ceiling.
I think, oh, sorry.
Oh, no, please.
I think also, like, you have to, I think it's hard sometimes for those of us who haven't seen ourselves very much to value ourselves as an audience. Like, because you remember that you're like a creator, but first you were an audience, first you were a fan. And I just realized actually recently that it took a really long time for me to value myself, not just as a creator, but as an audience. So believing that other people actually want to see what I want to see and what I'm writing. And I feel like once you do that, it's actually a bit of a mind shift, because you're sort of like, I am a valuable audience member, I am a valuable consumer, and surely there are other people out there like me who want to see that as well. So I think if you can kind of like get in that mindset, it helps a lot to sort of overcome this feeling that a lot of it is so impossible.
You know, I'm gonna link to.
Okay,
Oh yeah, sorry. That's
So we're a little bit over. Again, this is the first panel of the con. Thank you guys for being here. I also want to say we're in a world right now where, especially this morning and last night, it feels sometimes like the world is filled with hate, and the world is filled with not wanting what this panel represents. You guys are all here this morning. Let's just remember that if we all raise our voices, we can push further along the path that we're all hoping for. Thank you guys for coming out.